Yeah, I think so. Maybe.
Maybe we know it.
Maybe we know it. Let's stand up. We're going to give it a shot. First. Seated. Take your Bibles for a moment and open with me to Matthew 18. Matthew 18, talking about the doctrine of the church. And I wanted to have you consider with me for just a moment this morning the future of the church. What does the Bible say about the future of the church? And so in Matthew 18, these familiar lines of our Savior in Matthew 18 and Matthew 16, Matthew 16, and in verse 18, Matthew 16, 18, I say to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. So we have the promise of Christ that he will build, and he will superintend, he will protect his church, and the forces of darkness, symbolized here by the gates of Hades, cannot conquer it. Incidentally, this promise pertains to the church. It does not pertain to Bible colleges or seminaries or mission agencies or fellowships or associations. It's for the church. And all these other parachurch organizations, many of them are wonderful. They do great things, but they don't have the promise of Christ that they will be unconquerable. So the church is going to last as long as Christ intends it to last. Now that doesn't mean that the church everywhere on the planet grows equally or has the same kind of quality of life. So for example, for much of the last couple of hundred years, the United States of America has been a place where true religion, churches, have done very, very well. In other places around the world, like Africa, like Europe, have done relatively poorly. There have been some kind of religion in Europe, but it's largely Roman Catholicism or something like that does not really glorify God. Now we're beginning to see in our lifetime things change. And it looks like in North America, the church is shrinking. The church is contracting. Whereas in other parts of the world, like China and like Africa and maybe South America, genuine Christianity is growing and doing well. So that, we don't mean by this that every single church everywhere is always going to last for 1,000 years, or that they all have the same quality of worship to the Lord. So go to Revelation and look at chapter 2, Revelation chapter 2. And in Revelation chapter 2, we have the beginning of this set of 7 letters addressed by Jesus to local churches in Asia Minor. And these are specific local churches. You can see that in Ephesus, verses 1 through 7, Smyrna, 8 through 11, Pergamum, 12 through 17 and so on. And the word church occurs many, many times, a couple of dozen times in chapters 1, 2, and 3. When you hit chapter 4, the word church disappears from the book of Revelation. And you don't find it again until the very end when the Lord Jesus is issuing some wrap-up material. We have an explanation for that we believe is accurate, founded in facts, and it is this. Chapters 2 and 3 are addressing churches in the church age. Chapter 4 begins a different dispensation, and it would be the beginning of the tribulation period, and the church is no longer on the earth. There is no church on the earth when the tribulation period starts. All believers are raptured, and they're taken away, and the church, which has defined the last 2,000 years, is now done. We find that hard to even imagine. You know, what would that look like? And there have been people who have tried to figure out how exactly that would work. But it's pretty hard to picture a life without a church, isn't it? There is another reference or another event that is tied to the church. So in Revelation, go to chapter 19. Revelation 19. Revelation 19:7. Let us rejoice and be glad and give the glory to him, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. This event described in 7, 8, 9, and 10 is called the marriage supper of the Lamb. And there's this entity called the bride. Can you think of another place in the scriptures where the language of a bride or a bridegroom is used like this? Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5 would be a key one. There's another little hint that I find very, very intriguing, and it's in the message of John the Baptist, way back in John, where he says, you know, at a wedding feast, all the attention is on the bridegroom and the bride. The friend of the groom, in our language today, that'd be the best man. He just stands off to the side and he rejoices at this happy, happy day. Now, why would John the Baptist, a Jew, use that particular language? Well, you know, everybody can relate to it. A wedding is a huge celebration for the whole village. But I have wondered, I've speculated, if perhaps John had a little insight into the church. The church seems to be the bride. That seems to be what this is. And so this is some sort of celebratory festival in heaven with all the saints of the church age gathered together as the bride of Christ. And there's this feast, this celebration, and we don't have a lot of information on it, probably because we're not equipped to understand, you know, what would this be. If he were to have fully described it, we couldn't get it. So the church does exist on into the future, but here's another thing that's hard for us to understand. In the millennial kingdom, the church is not the focal point of God's program. I'm not even sure the church exists in the millennium. I'm not sure if it's there. I have no clue what it is or what it looks like. Instead, in the millennial kingdom of Jesus Christ ruling and reigning for 1,000 years here on earth, what is the focal point? Jesus, he's the king, he's the ruler, he's the leader, and his attention is going to be largely on Israel. The nation of Israel is going to be the hub of the world. And so the church is now, if it exists at all, it's off to the side. And again, that will be strange for us because all that we have known for 2,000 years is the church. But God is going to keep his promises to Israel too, and that will occur during the millennial kingdom. Okay, so we're done with Sunday school opening, and we're going to be starting our Sunday school lesson in about a minute. and we're going to be looking at animal husbandry and agriculture this morning. Good morning. We are glad that you are here. To those of you who are joining us via our live stream ministry, we're glad that you're with us this morning as well. We're in a series of studies on Bible backgrounds, and this is the third installment in that series. It's a little different style, as you can tell. We're not necessarily studying the Bible, we're studying the background of the Bible, things that help us to understand it better. The people groups, the nationalities, the languages, the culture, the way of life, those kinds of things that were apparent because people in Bible days were immersed in them. But we, living in a different century and a different continent and a different culture, have to think about these things, have to work at it to get the full impact of what was ordinary for people in biblical lands and days. So this morning's lesson has to do with animal husbandry and agriculture. And I need to make a couple of remarks about this even before we get started. And it's this: farming and animal husbandry in biblical times were so embedded in the culture, it was so obvious that you almost didn't have to talk about it. It was everywhere. So if you yourself were not a shepherd or a farmer, your brother, your next door neighbor, your cousin, your uncle was a farmer or was a shepherd. And if you lived in a village, by the time the Israelites settled down in the land of Canaan, about 1400 BC, and began to live in settlements, towns, villages, cities, after having been nomads for a long time, when they began to settle down, I say, in towns, some degree of specialization did happen. So before that time, almost everybody was a shepherd because you lived in tents, you moved from place to place, and your life revolved around caring for the animals. So everybody, husband, wife, kids, everybody was a shepherd of some kind. When you settled down in a town, some specialization did begin to happen. So, you've got somebody who builds furniture and he's a carpenter. You've got somebody who works with metals and he's a smith. You've got somebody who throws clay and he's a potter. And so this specialization did happen. But even with that, if you got up in the morning and walked through the village to go, get some bread at the bakery, what would you see all around you? Sheep, goats, donkeys, cows, chickens, and as you look past the houses, farm fields everywhere. Whereas we, in our culture now, how do you get your bread? Well, you go to Hannaford and you buy it in some plastic bag. Where does it come from? Well, I don't know, I guess they got a bakery somewhere, Concord or Manchester, or, I don't know, where does it come from? And where do they get their flour? Well, Iowa, I guess, or Nebraska. How do they harvest it? These machines that are the size of our church, and they pump it into bins. But back in those days, in the biblical world, you would watch and you would see, and you were very likely a part of the entire process. Planting, harvesting, processing the grain, taking the grain, turning it into a finished food product. So you were very well acquainted, and all of this was part of your life. So there are hundreds and hundreds and thousands of references in the Bible to daily life that we have to kind of puzzle about. Say, now why would he say it like that? But in the day of David, or in the day of Jesus or on the day of Paul, when he uses a reference, people in that day wouldn't even have to think about it. So, what you're looking at is a Bedouin shepherd in the Negev. Remember, the Negev is the Sinai Peninsula, and there are still Bedouin. The Bedouin are not exactly identical to the Arabs. They share similar traits, but the Bedouin tribes are a little different from Arabs. There still are Bedouin. Their way of life is disappearing, and part of it has to do with national boundaries, whereas in ancient days they would just wander around the whole territory. Nowadays you have border crossings and barbed wire fences and things. And so, there are fewer Bedouin that are actual nomads. There still are some in Israel, Jordan, a few in Egypt, but you can tell that he's got both sheep and goats in his herd. He's wearing traditional Bedouin dress, a robe or a tunic, and a kafaya for headgear. Notice the landscape. There's some bushes and stuff, a little bit of browse. Goats are good at browsing. Sheep are better as grazers. And so, he's got a dog too. See that? He's got a dog to help out. Bedouin are okay with dogs. Arabs don't like dogs so much. But there are dogs that are used in herding. So here's a Bedouin tent, and you might also pick up on the Jeep in the background. So I remember, 1988, I guess it was the last time I was in Israel, driving through the Jordanian desert. You'd see, in those days, most Bedouin tents were black. They used black goat's wool. But you'd see a Bedouin tent, 100 yards off the road, and it had a satellite dish. So the old world meets the new. You've got a tent. Tents are traditionally divided into 3 apartments: the men's apartment, the women's apartment, and a common area. And so I don't know if that's still true, but it was true for hundreds, thousands of years. But it's a pretty big place in there. You can see that's a pretty spacious layout that they have. And they pitch their tent knowing where the sun is going to be and where the winds are at any given time of the day, so that they can open opposing curtains and get a little breeze going through. Here's a water cistern, and there still are active cisterns in the wilderness. It is sealed up so that it doesn't just evaporate. But they would have underground channels, actually, that might spread out for quite a distance in different directions and feed into a big chamber, and the chamber could be as big as our church, underground. And they, not just people now, but back through the centuries, they would repair them. They would get in with plaster and plaster up the walls so that the water doesn't just leak through fissures in the rock and disappear. But this is available for herds and so on. So you have to lower a bucket through that little opening there. There's even references. Remember, Solomon built cisterns and water catchment systems in the wilderness. So did Hezekiah, so did Uzziah. So at various times in Israel's history, water's always been a big deal in Israel. But they would build even aqueducts out in the middle of nowhere to catch water up in the hill country and carry it out into more arid terrain. So there are hundreds of references to sheep and shepherding in the Bible. I'm not even sure that you could, I don't mean just the word sheep or just the word shepherd, but just all kinds of references. So, for example, I am the good shepherd. Where's that found? John 10, the chapter of the Good Shepherd. In that same chapter, I call my sheep by name, they hear my voice, and they follow me. How about in John 21, Jesus says, feed my flock. To whom is he speaking there, John 21? Peter, that's Peter. Or the Lord is my shepherd. Psalm 23. By the way, if you want a great little devotional book to read sometime, Philip Keller, Keller, A Shepherd Looks at Psalm 23. You can probably find it on eBay or Amazon. Great little book, full of great practicality. I highly recommend it. So, the Lord is my shepherd, and so many others. So, the particular sheep that is used widely in Israel and surrounding territory, Jordan, Lebanon, is called the fat-tailed sheep, because the back end of the sheep, the tail, accumulates a great deal of fat, and it could weigh as much as 25 or 30 pounds. Actually, now this strikes us as so bizarre, but eating the fat of the sheep was a thing. That was a delicacy. So, it's kind of like when you read about Gloucester, Mass, or New Bedford, Mass, back in the late 1700s or early 1800s. The whalers would eat sometimes whale blubber, and you're thinking, you've got to be kidding me. Who would do that on purpose, But it's just like sushi, who eats raw fish? But somebody does. So anyhow, there's the sheep and the shepherd. Sheep shearing. Sheep shearing could occur at any point in the year. It was quite often done after winter in the springtime. Typically one shearing a year, but depending on your flock, you could do it a couple times a year. The ewes who are going to be lambing were often sheared before they gave birth. And that would often be in the springtime, not always. And he's using traditional sheep shearing clippers or scissors. You can see that's the kind of thing that would have been used a couple thousand years ago too. In big production farms, of course, they have metal clippers now, electric clippers. But here's an Arab shearing a sheep. And sheep and goats were often kept in the same herd. This one is special because not only does it have sheep and goats, but I actually see a few donkeys in there too. And I think I see a dog. So what would you, well, put it this way. Remember Sisera, the Syrian general in the book of Judges? He escaped a rout and went and fled to a woman. And he was so tired, he said, I need to lie down, I got to lie down. And he said, do you have something to drink? I'm so thirsty. Do you remember what she gave him? Milk, and it was probably goat's milk. Cow's milk was largely unknown in biblical times. If you had a cow, it was going to be an ox. And what did you use an ox for? Pulling, plowing, hauling a cart. You didn't milk cows necessarily. I mean, it wasn't, they knew that you could keep cows and milk them, but most milk production in the ancient Middle East was from goats. You could milk sheep, and you could milk camels, but most of the milk came from goats. And what would you do with it? Okay, not so much soaps. Cheese. Now this is not cheese like we think of cheese. It's not like you go to Hannaford and you get a brick of Monterey Jack or something or other. This cheese, and actually a favorite method of turning it into cheese, is to take a couple of gallons, pour it into a leather bag. It's waterproof, obviously, and actually have a pair of them, and you sling it over a donkey, and you just walk from where you're going to be to the next village. And by the time you got to the next village, yeah, yeah, Sharon is loving this. What do you have in the bag after 4 or 5 hours of slogging along a country trail? It's kind of a cross between yogurt and cottage cheese. Yeah, so it's and that's the cheese. It's a very soft cheese. Curds, is essentially what it is. But they did use that. That was a favorite. They would eat that a lot. It would be something that you would make sauces out of. At mealtime, you'd have bread and you'd have curds. and you would kind of you'd take your pita, your bread, use it like a spoon, dip it into the curds, and eat that. So that's going to be what you live out. So sheep and goats, and what else do you do with your sheep and goats besides milk them? You eat the meat. You wouldn't eat too many, because if you ate too many, your herd is gone. So if you had a large enough herd, you might be able to sell some of them to other people. Or if you were near a town, you could sell them to the butcher. And so the butcher is going to process them and sell them to villagers. Another very important, maybe more important than the milk, sacrifices are important, sure. Even more economically important than the milk and the meat was the wool. So with sheep, the milk, the meat, and the wool, all three are important economic wealth builders. And so the wool is a whole class unto itself. And there's different breeds that have different kinds of wool. Goat's wool was less desirable, but they did use it some. And so, taking care of sheep is a big deal. Beast of burden in Bible times, donkeys, probably the most prevalent. Oxen are used for pulling carts, plowing, pulling, threshing sledges, and camels. Horses were not generally used as beasts of burden. They were used in warfare. They were used to pull chariots, and they were used for mounted troops. But the ancient Middle East didn't really think about using horses as pulling carts or plowing with. You didn't do that. That was largely unknown. Probably horses require more care and maintenance, and so that could be a part of it. Horses were associated with wealth. So kings had horses. In fact, remember, God told the Israelites in Deuteronomy, when you get a king, there's two things that he's not allowed to multiply. Do you remember what they were? One is wives, and the other is horses. Don't multiply wives, and don't multiply horses. Solomon, by the way, did both. So donkeys, probably the most commonly used beast of burden. And donkeys can hold hundreds of pounds, very sturdy. Donkeys actually are not as stubborn as a lot of people think they are. They can be, but extremely useful and widely. In fact, that donkey there is probably the one that Mary rode on to Bethlehem. The harness, I think. Yeah. So, what kind of a donkey was it that she rode on? Rachel got it. We have this picture in our head, don't we? Joseph is plodding along and he's pulling the donkey by the reins. The Bible doesn't actually say that she rode a donkey. We paint that picture in our heads, but the Bible does not say that Mary rode a donkey. Is it possible she even walked? Sure. Could she have ridden a camel? Maybe. But, there's an excellent chance that she actually walked from Nazareth to Bethlehem. A plow used in ancient Israel environments was a scratch plow, not a molding plane plow. So what it does is it's a single point, and on this point of wood, they would fasten iron or bronze tip. And that way when you hit a rock, you don't break the plow. But it's not several plow shears in a row, it's just one. You're plowing one furrow at a time. And it's also not lifting up a seam of soil and tipping it over. You're not turning over the soil. You're just putting a scratch about 4 inches deep. And then you go back through after you've plowed your field. Can you imagine doing that one furrow at a time in an acre? And then you go back through and you plant your seeds. And then you go back over it again to put the dirt back over on top of the seeds. So extremely laborious. but oxen were used to pull the plow. And I can't even imagine how exhausting that would be, because you are using your body. Usually it's got a handle over here, and then you've another handle here, and then you're kind of standing on the back side of it to keep the weight so that the point is down in the ground. After 50 feet, I would be ready to retire. But these guys did this all day long. So, yeah. And the camel. Camels are amazing animals. Camels do show up in the Bible quite a little bit. Again, another picture we have in our head is the three wise men coming from the east with their camel caravan. And was it camels? Was it three? Well, we don't know. We have these ideas in our head, but that's what they are, is ideas. Camels can weigh, the dromedary, which is a single humper, can weigh over a ton, from 900 pounds up to a ton. And a single camel can drink 53 gallons of water in 3 minutes. And then they can go for several days without drinking at all. And God has equipped them to handle arid conditions, even to the point where they have special tissues in their nostrils to recapture water vapor, so that when they exhale, they're not losing too much water at any given time. So they're just amazingly equipped. They can run 40 miles an hour, and they can run 25 miles an hour at for a sustained time. So camels were used, especially for long distance transport. They also are associated with a little higher social class. Caravans, merchants, and so on. Farmers would be much more likely to have a donkey to use for transport. So the kinds of agricultural products that are found in the Bible times: wheat, barley, rye, spelt, millet, and then various kinds of fruit-bearing trees, including olives, citrus, vines like cucumbers, grapes, dates, figs, apples, beans, lentils, onions, pomegranates, and more. Lots and lots of herbs and spices in and around Israel. And so, they had a very healthy diet. They didn't have large amounts of red meat. There does seem to have been quite a lot of fish eating in Israel. A lot of fish were consumed both from the Mediterranean and from the Sea of Galilee. In fact, it looks like probably there was a thriving fish trade out of the Sea of Galilee to transport fresh fish down to the Jerusalem area every day. It's possible that Peter, James, and John had a part of that. It's possible that they not only ran the boats up on the Sea of Galilee, but do you remember? John knew the high priest. He was acquainted with Caiaphas and Annas. His family knew their family. Well, now, if he's from Galilee, John was a fisherman, and it's possible that it was like a family business. And so maybe even every night they would load a cart with fresh fish and bring it down to the Jerusalem area for the fish market in the morning. So, here's a fig tree. Figs are fascinating plants as well. Figs grow on the trunk. So, they grow on little twigs that come off the trunk itself, as well as among the leaves. And so it looks just really weird, but those are figs. Figs are fertilized, get the seed to set by means of a special wasp that has exactly the right length ovipositor to get inside the flower and fertilize the flower. What do you suppose those are? Those are not figs, and those are not apples. Those are pomegranates. Pomegranates were a very, very desirable fruit, very much loved in the ancient East. If you've ever opened one up, it's got little tiny seed pockets all throughout and so on. and it's got a little hard kernel inside each seed. You generally just chew it up and spit out the seeds. But they would make juices and things. It was sweet. How about this? This is a citrus. Probably that's the same thing. Citron wood is an entirely different thing, but this could be called a citron. It's called, today it's called a bomelo or a pomelo. It's about this big, and it's like a grapefruit. It's sectioned inside, but it's much sweeter than a grapefruit. It's not bitter or sour. It's not as sweet as an orange. So the flavor is somewhere in between grapefruit and orange, but on the sweeter side, but big with a real thick rind. There are hundreds of acres of bomelo groves, especially in the Negev, down near Beersheba. So threshing and winnowing grain, and this is a pretty good diagram here. So this thing over here is a threshing sledge, and it's boards that are fastened together, and then what in the world are all these little, well, those are stones that have been fastened to the underside in little tiny cavities. Why do you want stones on the bottom of your threshing sledge? Well, it's because you're going to have your cows walk around. Here's the sledge with a couple of people on it, or you could pile rocks on it for weight. What's it intended to do? It's crushing up the straw, the wheat or the barley or the rye, and it's just pulverizing it, loosening things up. And then after you've had your cow walk around on it all day long, you've got a pile of stuff, and you take a winnowing fork, and you get a fork full of it, and you throw it up in the air. And you want to do that usually in the evening, when the evening breeze takes over. Not too much, because if it's too strong a wind, what's going to happen? Blows your grain away too. Well, the grain you want to fall back down, but the chaff you want the wind to blow away. So there are several things about threshing and winnowing. For example, in the law, God said, do not muzzle the ox that treads the grain. What does that mean? So the cow, he's doing all the work for you. He gets to eat the grain that he's walking on. It would be cruel to stick a muzzle over his nose so that he can't take a little nibble now and again. If he's doing the work, well, then he gets to share in the profit of it. And think of David in 2 Samuel 28-29. A pestilence comes across the land because of David's own foolishness. And God says, you've got to offer a sacrifice, and you've got to do it fast. And he sees the angel of the Lord standing over the city of Jerusalem with a sword drawn. And he runs out and comes to the top of a hill. And there's a guy named Araunah the Jebusite. And it was his threshing floor. And David said, I need to buy this piece of property right now. And Araunah said, do you remember what he said? You can have it for free. And he says, look, I got cows here. That's your sacrifice. The wooden implements, the sledge, the yoke, that's wood. That's going to be to start the fire. And so just take it. And David said, no. He said, I'm buying it. I'm not going to offer something to God that cost me nothing. I'm buying this piece of property from you right now. So, incidentally, that piece of property later became the temple. That's the hill that the temple was built on under his son. So how do you get the grain? You've winnowed it, you've threshed it, now you've got a pile of raw wheat or raw barley. Well, there are several ancient methods for grinding grain. You're looking at a saddle quern, and so you've got a rubbing stone and a saddle shaped block. That saddle stone is quite often basalt, very rough but very rugged stone, and the roughness helped to grind up. And what you do is you rub it back and forth, as seen in this Egyptian figure. So she's got a saddle quern there, the rubbing stone held, and then, how long does it take to grind enough wheat into flour to make a loaf of bread? Wow. Think of doing that every day. Here's another way, a grain mill that's hand powered. So God said in Deuteronomy 24, do not take a hand mill or an upper millstone as a pledge. Why aren't you allowed to do that? So somebody gets into trouble financially and says, I need to borrow some money. And you say, fine, but I need a little collateral. How do I know you're going to pay me back? And he says, all I've got is my hand mill. And you don't take it. You say, we're good. You can have 20 bucks or 100 or whatever, because that's how he's going to eat. So there are ancient depictions of two women seated on the floor of a tent, say, both with a hand on that handle, and they're going around and around and around. So you'd pour the raw grain into that opening in the center, and there's just a little bit of a cone on that lower mill, so that the grain, as it gets ground, filters down. It's vibrating, so on, and the grain runs down between the stones, and the finished grain is going to come out of the sides between the two stones. Here's a large millstone, upper and lower, and so that pillar in the middle is fastened to the roof, and it goes through a hole in the lower. You can see it a little bit better on this one. See the donkey? So here's a log, and it goes down into the lower millstone, and the donkey walks around and around, and it rotates this upper millstone. It's slowly spinning. He's just walking around and around and around. And so you put your raw grain on that lower millstone. Here's a different kind over here. They're conical. So here's a square opening for a shaft for an animal, and then up here, there's the upper millstone is almost like an hourglass, and the lower millstone comes to a point, a cone inside of it. And so you'd put your grain up there, and then it grinds it as it falls down between the cones. Here's a tanur. A tanur is a clay oven, and what you do is you make this out of clay and mud and straw on the ground, and then you start a fire in it, and when the fire is burned down to charcoal, you take your lumps of bread dough and throw them around the inside to the wall, and it bakes very fast, 10 minutes, and a loaf of bread is done. And then it's an art form to get the bread off without dropping it into the fire or burning your fingers. But this isn't called a tanur, more commonly a bread oven. And so, can you see the features of this? So here's the chimney over here. Here's the fire with an opening. And here's the spot where you put your bread dough. On this one, what's the chief challenge on this one? Can you guess what the chief Okay, sticking to the wall is kind of important. That's a big one. There's one even more basic than that. Very hard to start the fire, because where does the oxygen come from? It's sealed up all the way around the bottom, so there's no inlet for the air. So it's difficult, very smoky, to get the fire started. I presume women in the ancient world had that pretty well licked. This one would be a lot easier to work with, because you've got the firebox down here underneath, and then chimney, so you've got airflow. So you can start the fire, and then you bake the bread inside here. So dozens and dozens of different kinds of recipes out of the ancient world, some of which are still being used down to today. Different populations of Jews and Arabs and Lebanese and so on all have different recipes, different features of grains and flavorings and so on that go into the bread. So bread, we'll talk more about it in a later lesson. Bread, a huge deal. Bread is life. Bread is a meal. If you were really hungry at 2 in the afternoon and you picked a bunch of olives and some grapes and some dates and ate that, even if you ate 1.5 pounds, that's a snack. If you have bread with the dates or the olives or the grapes, it's a meal. Bread makes a meal. So, questions? Yes, yes, exactly. Remember the Lord Jesus, it's in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, 7, somewhere in there, he says, if you cause offense, if you cause a little one, a young Christian, he seems to mean, to stumble, it would be better, remember how it goes? To have a millstone tied around your neck and you be cast into the sea. So, and people would picture this. If you have that tied around your neck, you're not coming up for air. The application is be especially careful with young Christians. Be especially concerned about baby Christians. Any other comments, questions? So next week we're going to be starting with trades and occupations, different ways of making a living that are found in the Bible and what they're about. Okay, let's close in prayer. Father in heaven, thank you for time together this morning. We ask your blessing upon the morning service, that Jesus Christ would be exalted. Thank you for the opportunity to be together in Jesus' name. Amen.